Firstly, I welcome Dr. Rajiv Raman. He is a senior consultant at the Department of Veterinary Services, Shankar Nethralaya, Chennai. He is also visiting faculty to the Vision and Eye Research Unit, Angela Ruskin University, Cambridge, and Dr. NTR University of Health Sciences, Vijayawada. He is also visiting faculty to BITS Pilani and Chitkara University, Chandigarh. Dr. Rajiv Raman, he has more than 250 publications in peer-reviewed journals and 14 chapters, including a chapter on diabetic retinopathy in the prestigious Ryan's textbook of retina. He has won the Asia Arvo Young Investigator Award, the Ruby Bannock Memorial Award for the Best Researcher at Shankar Nethralaya, Chennai, Dr. T.L.K. Rome Memorial Endowment Award, and the C.N. Shroff Award from at the All India Ophthalmic Society in 2019. Sir, it's a privilege for us to have you amongst us, and I would like to start the session with your presentation. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a real pleasure uh, being in this meeting and such a nice meeting arranged and very good program. And I hope this session, all the listeners will really benefit. Uh, Let me share my slides and then let's see whether, can you see the slides?
Yes, sir. They're visible.
Yeah. So let 1 minute. I'll just reduce this. So next couple of minutes, I'll be sharing some thoughts on brolucizumab in the management of neovascular AMD. And today we know that it is available in our country and how we can translate the evidence which is there currently about this drug into our clinical practice. So in the management of neovascular AMD, there are a lot of anti-VEGFs already in the market, and many players are there, and you have one new agent which we can use. So just to compile all of them, Avastin has been there for long. There is always this fear of endophthalmitis, off-label use, but still in many parts of the country, it has been used. We have ranibizumab, again by Novartis, very good, robust evidences. I think no other anti-VEGF has such robust evidence as ranibizumab. And they also had India-centric special costing, which is there with this drug. We also have biosimilar, though there were initial fears of inflammation, but over a period of time, uh, it is one of the good alternative for ranibizumab, but however, more in practical sense, people use it as an alternative of Avastin. We have aflibercept, very good evidences now on the the efficacy of this drug in neovascular AMD. However, cost of treatment is a limiting factor. It has definitely found a place in treating fibrovascular PEDs and polypoidal disease in our country. PDT still has a place in managing PCV. However, with time, now currently the problem is availability of PDT because only few machines across the country, and cost is also an issue. The treatment strategies have evolved over time, and now the standard treatment regime, which has good evidence that it seems to be good, is treat and extend way of treating AMD, which actually means that you increase the follow-up by 2 weeks. So you start injecting, and after your initial injections, if you feel that there is no disease activity, you can extend the treatment by 2 more weeks, but you inject that visit. And you can increase every time like this 2 weeks till a maximum of 3 months. And if there is no disease activity, if there is a disease activity, you reduce the treatment interval by 2 weeks. This seems to be a good treatment method, and it has definitely, the efficacy seems to be similar to the monthly treatment regime. Less number of injections, definitely better disease control, and seems that this also has less cost. However, when we start treating our AMD patients in real life, many a times we do want to follow evidence-based medicine, and we start with treat and extend. And after some time, we know that our patients, they don't want injection at each visit. And then we switch to what is called as PRN. where you do tend to tell the patient that better to come every month, but we'll inject whenever there is activity. And after some time, he is tired coming every month also. And that time you switch to wait and extend. You call every time 2 or 3 weeks later and you extend your follow up and even you don't treat. And if you assume there is a neovascular AMD who had 3 intravitreal injections and disease activity totally subsided, and you follow treat and extend, you will be giving 7 injections in a year and you will have 7 visits in a year. You follow PRN regime, you'll have 3 injections in a year, but you'll have 12 visits in that year. And if you are following wait and extend, you'll have 3 injections and 7 visits. Though you feel that do the PRN and wait and extend seems to be better as far as patient pocket is concerned, but we know that by reducing the number of visits, there is a chance of missing an activity. And if we reduce the number of injections, there is suboptimal outcome. And it's not only our country, this is the real-time data of nearly many of the European countries, where we do see that initially with good number of injections, there is a good improvement. And then the treatment effect, the benefit in terms of best corrected visual acuity seems to reduce over a period of 2 years. And the reasons are these: the number of visits and the number of injections. Long-term outcome, what we are looking at is ideally no membrane. However, many times when you tend to undertreat, you get fibrosis. And when you tend to overtreat, you get atrophy. So we don't want these things. We want a good outcome. And the big question is that who decides which treatment regime and which drug to be used in a patient of neovascular AMD? It's actually the patient who decides. And the problem is the decision is dependent on many factors: the awareness about disease, of the realistic expectation of the treatment, the cost of visits, other comorbidities, family support, fear of travel in these COVID times, the fear of injection itself. And one bad experience of an injection usually puts off the patient for the next injection. So there are a lot of factors which determine, and as I told you, it is the patient who decides what to be given. Uh, as ophthalmologists, we do know and we have learned from over a period of time that the disease activity is dependent on presence of fluids in each compartment. It may be subretinal fluid or intraretinal fluid or a sub-RPE fluid. And however, this concept has come more recently, though we were looking for residual fluids. But if you look at all the landmark trials, Anchor, Marina, ViewCat, and Ivan trials, they all speak about reduction in the central subfield thickness. They don't talk about these fluid, that how much of each fluid has gone. And that's because all these studies had actually used a time domain OCT. And we know time domain OCT has lower resolution, radial scans, interpolated data, no registration. And yes, they did tell that there is residual fluid, and those who have these fluid, they have poor outcome, but they never compartmentalize these fluids, which whether it is intraretinal or subretinal. And we know that the current OCTs, the SD OCTs and better OCT, the SWEP source, they have better resolution, and they can actually, we can look into the fluid in a more closer view. And there are 3 studies which actually looked into, which used spectral domain OCT: the Harbor study, the Hawk and Harrier, and Cedar and Sequoia study. They were for Ebesipar, the middle ones were for brolucizumab, and Harbor was for 2 doses of ranibizumab. And these are the studies which actually had used spectral domain OCT. So, and we get a lot of information about the fluids from these 3 studies. So what is bad as far as CNVMs are concerned? As we saw residual fluid, we saw the thickness changes, but many of the studies have shown it is the central subfield thickness variability which is very important. And mainly if you look at CAT, Ivan, there were 2 studies, and then you have the Hawk and Harrier. Both studies showed that if a patient has a lot of fluctuations in this central subfield thickness, they are the people who have worse BCVA. So this seems to be a uniform parameter as far as the BCVA improvement in treatment of neovascular AMD is concerned. The Harbor study post-hoc analysis and even now the fluid study, it did show that they tried analyzing the fluids because they had used the spectral domain OCT, and they did find that those who have only intraretinal fluid seems to be the worst one in terms of best corrected visual acuity. In these studies, there was some protection, they said, with SRF, but I'll not go into this SRF debate. But definitely, these are the studies which did tell us that these fluids are more important rather than looking at only the thickness. So we have a couple of unmet needs in neovascular AMD. We want less injections, less visits, and definitely less residual fluid and less central subfield thickness fluctuation. And in 2019-20, there were two drugs which came. One was brolucizumab and another was from Allergan abicipar, and both were submitted to FDA for approval. And brolucizumab got approval on October 2019. Abicipar, however, had little more inflammations. That's the reason why this drug was not approved by FDA. Now, just telling about this molecule, this is a structure I'm sure many of you, we all are familiar with, a full-length antibody, and it has got two Fab fragment and one Fc domain. And of them, the colored ones which you see, the variable domains, are the ones which binds with anti-VEGF. And more so, if you look at those dots which are there, they are called as CDR, complementary related region. That's a specific site where it binds with anti-VEGF. And what Novartis actually did, they created some novel CDRs, and they had a small protein, a proprietary scaffold protein. They joined both of them and came out with this molecule, which is a little smaller molecule, a 26 kilodalton molecule called as brolucizumab. Now, there are some key characteristics of this molecule. Being smaller in size, we do expect that there will be more drug in a single injection. It causes more potent inhibition of VEGF-A. And being smaller in size, it has got a very effective penetration of the retina and choroid. And it has got a rapid systemic clearance, again, because of the smaller size. The studies which gave the approval, the FDA approval, was based on these two trials, the Hawk and Harrier study. They were conducted at different geographic locations. And Hawk had three arms, a 3 milligram, 6 milligram of brolucizumab, and aflibercept, which is again a standard of care. And the Harrier had only 6 milligram and aflibercept. So if you look at the design, initially there were 3 loading doses which were given for both. And then we know that when we start on Eylea, we increase the follow-up by 2 monthly injections. So after 2 months of the third loading dose, the patients are seen again. And if it was in a aflibercept arm, the intravitreal injection of Eylea was given. But if it was in a brolucizumab arm, there was an option. They tried looking at disease activity. If the disease activity was absent, it was increased to 1 more month, and third month the injection was given. And if the disease activity was present, the injection was given at 2 months. And then thereafter, every 2 months, the injection was given in this arm. And there were fixed time points where the disease activity was assessed. So effectively what it means is that you had group of patients of brolucizumab who were on 3 monthly injection rather than 2 monthly injection. And this was basically a non-inferiority trial. That means they wanted to look at whether it is similar to aflibercept. And this is the results as far as BCVA is concerned. So 16th week is the first time point. So 3 loading dose given, and 2 months later the patients came. And that's the time, if you look at both in Hawk and Harrier, results were very much similar as far as brolucizumab and aflibercept was concerned. The primary endpoint, again, the results were similar. And even at the secondary endpoint, brolucizumab was non-inferior to aflibercept 2 milligram. And as far as central subfield thickness is concerned, definitely you can see the line, the blue line, which is for brolucizumab. what you can appreciate is aflibercept is showing a lot of spikes, meaning this is what we don't want, because these are the variations in the central subfield thickness, which I told is bad. And what you can see is brolucizumab is more or less straight line, and there's a significant difference as far as the drying of brolucizumab is concerned as compared to Eylea. They tried looking at what type of fluids were reduced. So if you look at intraretinal fluid or subretinal fluid, even at 16th week, that is just with these 3 injections, those who were on brolucizumab had nearly a third more drying as compared to those with aflibercept. Same was true at each 1 year and 2 year follow-up for both intraretinal and subretinal fluid. Also with sub-RP fluid, which we know is sometimes difficult to treat. Even in the initial arm, nearly 30% of them, 30 to 33% of them had dried subretinal sub-RP fluid. This is the comparison at each point of absence of all the fluids. Dr. Ursula tried looking at a little more details of these fluids. She used an AI algorithm to detect these fluids. So you can see this is the manual, and this is how in the AI algorithm she could detect these fluids. And she could actually measure these fluids in nanoliters. And she divided the whole group, the Hawk and Harrier population, into those who had high fluids versus low fluids. And she did see that those who had these lower levels of fluid, maybe intraretinal, subretinal, or PED, they had better visual outcomes as compared to those who had residual fluids. So definitely intravitreal brolucizumab seems to have a better drying effect than Eylea. And just looking at how they defined the activity, so they used both anatomical criteria and functional criteria. The function was based on vision improvement, and presence of fluid or a reduction in or an increase in the thickness was considered as disease activity. And if you look at the disease activities which were assessed in both the studies, majority of that, it is the anatomical outcome. So even in practical, when we treat our patients, we don't rely alone on vision, but we need to look for functional, the anatomical markers, which are more important to determine the disease activity. They also did some probability analysis, and what they found that people who were treated with brolucizumab 6 milligrams, uh, they maintain 3 monthly interval for 1 year. Nearly about 50 to 60% of them will have 3 monthly injections. You don't have to reduce uh, the interval from 3 months to 2 months. And if a patient successfully completed the first 3 loading doses, and the first one was by 3 months later, very high likelihood, nearly 85% of them will continue to be this 3 monthly interval for the first year. That means that after loading dose in year 1, only 1 or 2 out of 10 will need more than 3 injections. Majority will be just these 3 injections which are there at 3 monthly interval. They also tried looking at 2 years outcome, and they looked into that if a person is with 6 milligram brolucizumab, what is the chance that till 2 years he will be on this 3 monthly interval, and that's about 40 to 45%. And if he completed the first year with this 3 monthly interval, not to reduce by 2 monthly, nearly more than 80% of them will continue to be on a 3 monthly regime even in the year 2. Again, what it means that in year 2, 8 of 10 will need just 3 injections. So definitely it does reduce the number of injections. So there is less need for injection, and there is a more drying effect as far as brolucizumab is concerned. The Hawk and Harrier study came out with some ocular safety profile, and you can see here they did see some inflammations, even retinal artery occlusion, endophthalmitis, and there was a post-marketing update by Novartis to keep a watch on these symptoms. So I tried doing a critical appraisal of this Hawk and Harrier study. There were some points, mainly like there were some mainly with Harrier study, arm of the study, more than 3 months disease duration and more patients with baseline SRF was there in the Eylea group. That shows that these are more chronic cases. You don't expect much improvement. There was also risk of unmasking the treatment assignment because the injector was unmasked. He knew what he is giving. That might have a bias as far as results are concerned. And in this study, there were only treatment naive eyes, and we do know that in our clinical practice, we do see patients who had multiple other injections. There was no comparison with Avastin or Lucentis, which is commonly used, and it didn't check the most common and regime which we use, that is the treat and extend regime. And when they went to FDA for approval, there was a little change in the formulation of what was asked for approval and what was used in Hawk and Harrier. So the FDA asked them to do another 6 months follow-up study. And these are the results from the follow-up study of Hawk extension study, which also showed that the benefit was continuing even in these 6 months. And based on these extension and Hawk and Harrier, brolucizumab got approval. Thereafter, that is after October 2019, there are a lot of real world evidences, and this is the one of the study, the Bruce study published by Dr. Kaiser's group, had about 42 patients, 60 injections. And in this real-time experience, they used patients who were previously treated with other anti-VEGFs, and they showed a good response in visual outcome. There was less disease activity. And in this series, they didn't find any inflammations. So what happens in the real world? So on February 23rd, there were 11 cases of occlusive vasculitis, and in March 30th, there were 21 cases. And we all knew during lockdown, we heard that there is a ASRS alert about this drug as far as use in neovascular AMD is concerned. And after that, there are several reports which have been published related to intraocular inflammation. Some key points are that majority of these inflammations occur within a month of injection, more so about 2 weeks is the period. It can happen both in treatment naive and previously treated group. And 75% of them, within 6 months, the inflammation is there. So again, it's not like only 1 month, it can go to 6 months. And the sad part is that 1/3 of them, they lose vision. So I think this is something we need to keep in mind. And Novartis proactively went ahead establishing a safety review committee, which had ophthalmologists, retina and imaging specialists, uvea specialists, and they tried looking at 4 points. What is the root cause of these events? How can we characterize a patient who will have a high risk of developing inflammations? What can we do to mitigate the incidence? And if somebody develops these inflammations, what should be done to treat it? And the think tank, this committee has come out with one report, how to treat these inflammations, which have been published now. And I'm sure with time, we'll get more knowledge about how to get rid of these inflammations. So as per Novartis post-marketing data, the incidence of these adverse effect of intraocular inflammation is nearly 10 in 10,000, meaning 1 in 1,000 patients injection. So I think this is something you need to definitely keep in mind. So what pre-injection considerations you should keep? Definitely don't inject if there is any inflammation. Look for anterior chamber and vitreous cells and flare, any features of old uveitis, both anterior segment or posterior segment, healed or active uveitis. Take a prior history of inflammation following injections, tend to avoid in them. And in the initial experience, it would be good idea to avoid any one-eyed patients. Investigations, definitely do a thorough indirect ophthalmoscopy, and if you have a wide field retinal photography, good to take that, and definitely look for a healed or an active vasculitis or uveitis in the posterior chamber. In OCT, besides looking at your membrane fluids, also try to look for vitreous cells, because these may be, again, these are the features which suggest inflammation and tend you should tend to avoid giving in these patients. The risk of 1 in 1,000 getting inflammation should be there in your consent form, and definitely you should tell them this to the patient. And more important, you should document all these negative findings also in your case record and alert the patients of the symptoms. If they have floaters, pain, pressure, ocular discomfort, which is persisting for more than 2 days, you have to actually educate them what the floaters are and how to look for it. They should look at a white background or no, a wall with a light and see that whether they see any floaters. Whenever they have excessive light sensitivity or they prefer goggles wearing, that is something again it should alert the patient. Or if they have a reduced vision or vision loss, and when they come to you, look for intraocular inflammation, vasculitis, or any vascular occlusive event. So this is the mitigation plan which have been published now in Ophthalmology Retina and also presented at EURetina. The key is give steroids in all forms. So even IV methylprednisolone has been given. And the second key is keep a low threshold for wide field fundus fluorescein angiogram. If you have a doubt, many times even in the hazy media, you can get to know the involvement of arterioles and venules. Some key clinical features of brolucizumab associated inflammation is Witt cells, vitreous opacities. Anterior segment, you can get non-granulomatous KPs, corneal edema. It can affect both arteries and veins, and you can get varying level of artery involvement, a small or a large caliber vessels, narrowing or occlusion. You can get sheathing. It can involve posterior pole or the peripheral vessels. Also, you should look for signs of ischemia on OCT. And retinal vein, again, it can be dilatation, narrowing, or a typical vein occlusive picture you can get. Sometimes they can present with optic nerve swelling. So now the big question comes whether you should inject this drug or not. I think you need to put this in perspective. The center round is actually the same size. That is the risk of intraocular inflammation. It's the way you look at benefit. If you feel that in some of your patients it will benefit, you see that circle as a big, automatically the risk circle seems to be smaller. And the moment you perceive this benefit small, the risk seems to be big. And that's something you need to keep into mind when you start using this drug. So definitely brolucizumab has answered a couple of these questions. There is less injection, less visits, there is less residual fluid, and definitely less fluctuation. It has answered a couple of these unmet needs. And this all has been because of the attributes of brolucizumab, the smaller molecule, greater reductions of CST, a 3-monthly regime, better drying effect. So it has addressed all these unmet needs. And now it is approved in India as Pegenex. This is the market rate, and good thing is they have come out with a special pricing for India, and that brolucizumab definitely represents an important treatment option for patients with neovascular AMD. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, sir. Sir, we have requested for the questions to be posted in the chat box, and we'll take them up at the end of the session.
Sure.
And sir, I'll thank you for your intellectual inputs.